So we're on chapter 26 of your world history, the last section. And this section is on the rise of conservatism in the West. So we're going to be talking about the conservative movement, the conservative victories in Britain and America, renewed patriotism, standing up to communism, perestroika and glasnost, and the changes in Eastern Europe, and on to the end of the Soviet Union. So in this picture we see the beginning of the rise of conservatism, and this is in President Ronald Reagan winning the election in 1980. So let's begin. The conservative movement. Well, you can call a conservative movement, if you take the word conservative, and you can think it could be in any dimension or any political realm, such as if you were a conservative Muslim, you would believe staunchly in the Islamic faith of Muhammad, right? So it depends on what you're conservative about. But we're going to be talking about the conservative movement during the time in the United States and Great Britain, and how this conservative movement influenced the people. So let's talk about the conservative movement here. People taking an active stand against the tide of what? Socialism, immorality, crime, drug addiction, communism, threat to the free world, against all of those things, as the liberals would hold those things in their ideology. Conservative movement would be against those things. And this was a groundwork that was set by some great thinkers such as C.S. Lewis and Malcolm Muggeridge, who were both Christians, and on to Russell Kirk, Barry Goldwater, and William Buckley Jr. in America. Now, I would not really consider, especially Barry Goldwater, a Christian, but his ideology was very conservative. So let's go on to the next. What do conservatives stand for? Okay, during this time, they stood for individual liberty as opposed to collective security. That means in the individual having rights and not just the ideology of politics, or the collective security having the main right, as in communism, where the group is more important than the individual. And on to free enterprise and sound money as opposed to the Keynesian manipulation and bureaucracy regulation. So what does that mean? Having freedom in business, freedom to do your business, and sound money. Keynesian is basically going into a debt, and a national debt, and having the bureaucracies handle everything, including the people. It's more socialism and communism. Number 3, the local government as states' right as opposed to the concentrations of power at the federal level. So giving the local states more rights than the whole government as a whole. And then number 4, the firmness and strength in the teeth of communist aggression as opposed to retreat and compromise. So having firmness against the teeth of communism, standing up against totalitarian government, and standing up to against murderous dictators is what they're saying, as opposed to just retreat and saying, okay, we're just going to let them be. So 4 important things for conservatives at this time: individual liberty, free enterprise and sound money, local government opposed to concentrations of power, and firmness and strength against communism. So today, up in the corner here, we have the Republican versus Democrat. Not necessarily two. You can have liberal type Republicans and more staunch Democrats too, but on the whole, Republican being small government, lowering the taxes, national security, family values, favor of the Second Amendment, which is arming ourselves, and the free market, capitalism, and pro-life. As for the liberal side, democratic side, large government, government controlling, higher taxes, individual rights such as gay rights and gun control and environmental issues and pro-choice, they say. But a lot of these, again, come back to the socialistic and communist stand against these things. So let's go on. I think you kind of get that. Victories in Britain, Great Britain, and America. In 1970 and 1980, political and economic conservatives were joined by conservative Christians to form a new right. This rekindled the conservative emphasis upon religious and moral issues. The sanctity of human life, the value of prayer in the Bible, and the importance of the family and traditional values became very important. In the right-hand side, we have, in his hand is the life of every creature and breath of all mankind. Individual rights, even the rights of a baby in the womb, so against abortion. And so now we have rekindling those conservative values that come from the Bible in the midst of our foundation as a nation, and basically to stand upon these as religious and moral issues. So now we have, before Puritans staying out of the government, but the government was formed on Christianity. So now to take an issue in standing for righteousness. Margaret Thatcher here of Great Britain. Great Britain in 1979, Margaret Thatcher became Britain's first prime minister, and she would remain until 1990, making the longest ruling leader of Britain in the 20th century, 11 years long. Her election was a response to the worsening controls of Britain's social economy. Also a sense of failure to assert itself against sovereign power in world affairs, making England seem quite weak. Prime Minister Thatcher made efforts to lower taxes, deregulate business, cut government spending, and reduce welfare dependency. And this met great success and improved the economy. Republican Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980. So this put America in a very conservative nature of politics. So the American conservative Ronald Reagan became the president in the United States with a victory in 1980 polls. President Reagan inspired many and emphasized free enterprise capitalism that made America great. Budgets, he thought, should be balanced. Trade and business should be free from government control. Ronald Reagan years became the longest period of vigorous and continuous economic growth since World War II. Lower taxes and less government regulation were what this government under Ronald Reagan was centered on. Renewed patriotism in Great Britain. So, Prime Minister Thatcher determined to build defenses and a new sense of national pride in England. In April of 1982, the communist country of Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, which were 400 miles off the coast of South America. Despite the United Nations' disapproval, the British made a decisive response and sent troops to the Falkland Islands that were backed by air power to recapture the islands, as the Falkland Islands were a colony. After a brief but bloody war, Argentina did surrender in June, and the British regained control of the Falkland Islands. The 1982 Falkland Island War was the most extensive naval conflict since World War II. It revealed new technologies in modern naval warfare. The British strategic bombers made the longest bombing missions in the history of warfare, flying all the way from England and returning at once 12,000 miles. This victory was met by an outpouring of patriotism from the people of England and a great display of national pride since World War II. So, renewed patriotism in Great Britain over the victory of the Falkland Islands being taken over by Argentina, which was a communist country. Standing up to communism. The rejection of containment. Remember we talked about Vietnam and how Vietnam was a no-win war, and the idea was just to contain it, to contain it the way it is, and not to stand up and actually win the war. So Ronald Reagan stood up and made it a priority to modernize and strengthen America's military. The Reagan Doctrine was an offensive policy of preemptive strikes to stop communism before it can enslave a nation. This was in complete opposition to containment, the containment theory that with both under President Truman and on into President Kennedy, and on into Nixon, and President Johnson and President Nixon all had containment. Now we have Ronald Reagan standing up to offensive policy against communism. I like what he said here. He says, communism works only in heaven where they don't need it, and in hell where they already got it. Quite a statement, huh? Renewed military strength. The Soviet Union decided to test America's response by invading Afghanistan in 1979. Sensing Americans' refusal to get involved, the Soviet Union gained confidence in Afghanistan. However, they underestimated the resolve of Ronald Reagan. Reagan supplied Afghan patriots with high-tech missiles for combat. And so on to the Reagan Doctrine that was upheld by sending troops not only to Afghan, but onto Grenada, an island in the West Indies that was going to be used by Fidel Castro as a military base to invade South America. So remember, Fidel Castro was a die-hard communist, and he was under the control of the Soviet Union, and he thought to take over Grenada so that he could use that as a foothold and base to invade all of South America. He definitely was a military type dictator, and he wanted to control all of America. In fact, he was very violent in everything he did. The United States troops rounded up the Cuban forces under Fidel Castro and sent them back to Cuba. So what happened under Reagan? He didn't tolerate Fidel Castro's ideas of taking over the Grenada. President Reagan also armed the Contra freedom fighters against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and sent advisors to El Salvador to prevent a communist takeover. So, as we see here, we have Ronald Reagan standing peace through strength, and onto the Reagan Doctrine, which was anti-communist approach that guided his policies and aimed at stopping the spread of communism in the world. The United States military force and many would undermine this communism, and the direct military political structure would strain the Soviet Union. And we'll find that this did happen. The communist tragedies. So some communist tragedies happened at this time. The Soviet atrocities were center stage in 1983 when Soviet fighter jets shot down flight KL-007, Cal 007, leaving Alaska. They were leaving Alaska for South Korea. They actually had come from New York to Alaska, and they were going to South Korea. And the Soviets claimed that the South Korean airline was a spy plane. But the death toll of civilians was traumatic. 269 passengers died, and the world looked on in their disregard for human life. The Soviets disregarded all of those 269 innocent passengers. Then came Chernobyl. Chernobyl was another tragedy. It happened in 1986 at a nuclear reactor plant in Chernobyl, who it's in Soviet Union in the Ukraine. So in the Ukraine, the towns of the Ukraine next to this nuclear plant were affected. It was a nuclear meltdown, and it first killed 23 people and contaminated a huge farm area, spewing a cloud of radioactive dust and debris into the atmosphere. An investigation revealed substantial aged equipment and inefficient monitoring of procedures of the nuclear plant. Unable to undertake this massive cleanup, the Soviet Union was forced to call in experts and money from the West, especially from the United States, and admit their overall bankruptcy of communist rule. As America went in and saw how poorly the nuclear reactor was being taken care of, they saw how poorly the whole Soviet government was failing. Now it's estimated now that possibly over 1 million people were affected some way by the radiation, and some very drastically. So let's go on. So now we see what's happening in the Soviet Union. Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. So President Reagan's response to increased Soviet military threat was the endorsement of a Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, a system of space-age weaponry designed to destroy enemy ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles in flight. So now President Reagan's response is to go to space and put our military in space so that we could destroy any ICBMs that were coming in to attack us. Well, the liberals at that time, they were totally against this, and so they labeled this the Star Wars program as being defensive laser weaponry. He said, and basically saying that it was unreliable and related to fantasy as the Star Wars program that was going on, the Star Wars movies that were going on. Nonetheless, Reagan's administration continued to press forward with renewed research in space-age technology. So now Reagan going to space in the midst of his defense system for the United States of America, SDI. Margaret Thatcher wrote, President Reagan's SDI, about which the Soviets and Mr. Gorbachev were so alarmed, was to prove central to the West's victory in the Cold War. As he went to space, because of the Soviet Union's problems at that time, they had not enough intelligence and not enough, or as for scientific technology in that, not intelligence, but technology, to the point of being able to fight the so-called SDI, or Star Wars program. And this led to the fall of communism and the victory of the West in the Cold War, which we'll find is true. Up here in the corner it says Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative. In 1983, Reagan announced his plans to develop and deploy a high-tech missile defense system based partially in space. Reagan will use the SDI to scare the Soviets and ultimately to force the new Soviet premier, Mikhail Gorbachev, to negotiate with him. During the arms talks with Gorbachev, Reagan will steadfastly refuse to stop R&D on the Star Wars system. So we'll see what happens here. So here's some pictures here of this time. The Strategic Defense Initiative. Social unrest in the Soviet Union. Social unrest increased as the economy of the Soviet Union worsened. The communists were spending so much time and money building weapons that they could not even provide the basic food, shelter, and clothing for their own people. Although powerful members of the Communist Party enjoyed a high standard of living during this time, most people were in poverty. The financial burden of sponsoring terrorist groups around the world and fighting in an unsuccessful war in Afghanistan added strain to the economy. Open dissent against the established regime began to surface in the Soviet Union. Then came problems in Poland, called solidarity. That's what the Polish called their stand against communism in Poland. The renewed strength of American stand against communism encouraged the people of Poland. Now, Poland is a communist-controlled country. In 1980, a movement of Polish nationalists called themselves Solidarity, and they stood up to the Soviets. They were led by Lech Walesa. Walesa, how you say it. Polish workers refused to work until their demands of freedom were met. In response, the members of Solidarity were imprisoned, and they were tortured, and they were executed. The United States responded with economic sanctions against communist governments, the whole communist government of Poland. Even Pope John II, and he, being a Polish native, denounced the Communist Party and called for the liberation of Poland. Okay, look at this picture. You can see where Poland is. These are all communist countries at the time, including bordering the Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania. Here we go, and Russia coming in. But here, Poland is where you can see that shadow nation in the past. Gorbachev meets with President Reagan in Geneva, Switzerland in 1985. Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985. Fearing American arms buildup and the brewing difficulties with the Soviet Empire, he met with President Reagan in Switzerland and later in Iceland to discuss the mutual limitation of nuclear arms. As a result of these meetings, INF, which is called Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, in 1987 was signed. This agreement was to remove their middle-range missiles from Europe. So they're looking at removing nuclear missiles. Hope and despair. The peoples of Eastern Europe rejoiced at the removal of Soviet missiles, especially pointed to them, right? Reports reached the West that the communists were on the verge of completely collapsing, a complete economic collapse, in their desperate effort to counter American progress in weaponry systems. The Soviets were suffering as food supplies became difficult to obtain, and there were disruptions of the heating and fuel and frequent power outages all over the Soviet Union. Poland withdraws from the Soviet Union. In the summer of 1988, Poland was again in turmoil. Severe economic hardships were causing a new wave of strikes and protests. The communist government in Poland was on the verge of legalizing solidarity again and negotiating with Lech Walesa, and the Soviets were on alert. So Poland succeeded in withdrawing from the Soviet Empire, and all of Eastern Europe would be threatened to do the same. Suddenly, the Soviet leader Gorbachev announced a drastic change of his Communist Party. So Poland now is again standing up under the Solidarity movement against the Soviet Union and against their communist regime. Before, of course, they went through torture and imprisonment, and now they're back standing against their government. The Soviets influenced first Poland. Soviets changed their policy to perestroika and glasnost. So what are these two things? Well, they were actually programs to reduce Soviet weapon strength, to free the enslaved nations of Eastern Europe, and to stop encouraging revolution and bloodshed throughout the world. Wow, can you believe that? To reduce Soviet weapon strength, to free enslaved nations, and to stop these communist revolutions and bloodshed in the world. In return, the United States and free nations promised to help the Soviet Union rebuild its economic and political system on a democratic, free enterprise model called perestroika, which means reconstructing. So perestroika to them is having the West, especially the United States, come in and help them reconstruct their economy, asking help. The communists also adopted a foreign policy known as glasnost, which means openness, glasnost. And they claimed they wanted world peace with no plans of conquest. So here we have pictures of glasnost and perestroika. We have Gorbachev here. I always know Gorbachev because he has, if you look on his head, he had this, this birthmark on his head. That's why you can tell who he is, at least I can. So here you see him as appealing to the West. Communists not yet defeated. Communists realized their weakness and hoped to catch up and surpass the free world at a future date. So they set their communism aside for the being. Without financial and military support of the Soviet Union, many communist client states and terrorist organizations throughout the world would suffer. So, though communists, took a break at this time, we'll see later on how they would catch up and think they could surpass the free world at a future date. So, but what amazing time in the midst of all that was happening for these countries to become free of the bondage of communism. Here's a picture here, and you can see down in the corner here. This is the USSR, Soviet Union's boat sinking. And you have all these countries that were looking for independence, which are quite a few. As we go, starting with Poland onto Moldova, Azerbaijan, on even to the Ukraine and Georgian and Kazakhstan and Lithuanians. And we're going to go over all this in the next section. So that's it.